Cleghorn, a groundbreaking exploration of how medicine has been historically misunderstood, dismissed, and mistreated women's bodies, pain, and illness. From ancient ideas of hysteria to contemporary experiences of medical gaslighting, Unwell Women traces the long cultural history behind diagnostic inequality and systemic neglect in healthcare. The book has become an essential text for conversations around gender, medicine, chronic illness, and patient advocacy. And we're delighted to be joined by author and cultural historian Elinor Cleghorn to talk about the research behind the book, the historical patterns that still shape healthcare today, and why these stories continue to resonate so powerfully with readers and patients alike. So without further ado, let's welcome Elinor in. Hello.
Hi. Hi. Thank you so much for having me, Rupert, and for that lovely introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
I think it was lovely just about after the time my tongue started working, but thank you for putting it that way. So it's a genuine pleasure to have you join us. I've loved reading your book. I've loved learning from your book. As I was saying before, it's not the easiest read at every turn, simply because the weight of women's suffering in the book is harsh at times. But it's written with a thoroughness, but a lightness and a concision that I really valued as a reader. And I think many, many others have as well. So it's a testament and a textbook, I think, at the same time, with a little bit of memoir at the end. And I appreciated all of that. So for those who haven't yet got themselves hold of a copy, here it is. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. So let's start with some of the questions. We'll get a little bit into the detail of these things, but let's start simple. Just what motivated you to write Unwell Women?
So there are a couple of main factors that motivated me to write Unwell Women, and chief among them was my own eventual diagnosis with lupus, an autoimmune disease that affects predominantly women. And I was diagnosed with this disease in 2009, just after my second son was born, following a complicated pregnancy that was caused by what was going on in my body that was causing the lupus. But for about 7 or 8 years before I was pregnant and gave birth to my son, I experienced what I later understood to be the characteristic symptoms of lupus, which included fatigue and pain, sun sensitivity, migraines, digestive issues, mental health issues. And every time I went to my GP, either in my sort of home village or at university in London, I was dismissed with some version of, you're experiencing all this because you're a young woman, because you're hormonal, because you're anxious, because you're stressed, because you're hysterical, in other words. So the diagnosis was difficult, of course. It's a whole new identity, a whole new narrative, a whole new set of parameters to negotiate. But it was also a vindication and a relief, because it made me understand that I was absolutely right to pursue answers about what was happening in my body, and that this hadn't all been in my head, and that the dismissal that I experienced from healthcare professionals was not my fault, that this was something to do with the system that I was in, with the gatekeeping that happened when I was first getting ill. So my own experience was really the kind of catalyst for writing Unwell Women. I am a doctor of history and philosophy and not a medical doctor. And as a historian, my first impulse is to look back to understand where we are in the present. So I was looking back through my own history, my own body's history, to try and understand where I was in the present with my diagnosis. But in order to also understand what had happened to me, I started looking back through medicine's history for patients like me. So I started looking at medical archives, things like the Wellcome Trust, papers published online, to find young women who had lupus and to sort of read their case studies. And what I found there, so there was one in particular, a young woman named Grace, who died in 1908 in what was then called the London Hospital. And the cause of her death was a very similar heart condition to one that I had. And when I read over her case notes, her symptoms felt so similar to mine. Her experiences felt so similar to mine. And looking back at her history, she had also been told that she was a hysterical young woman by the doctors in the very early 20th century. So it struck me that medical science, biomedicine, had progressed exponentially in this century, virtually century, since I've been diagnosed. But what hadn't really moved, the needle had not moved when it came to the treatment of women who are unwell without immediate explanation, nor to the attitudes towards women's unexplained pain. So these were the two main factors. And as I researched, the more I researched, the more I thought about this subject, the more I understood that this just wasn't an issue that was happening around, say, autoimmunity. It was deeply embedded and ingrained in the majority of illnesses, health conditions that women experience in their lives. So to really get to the roots of why this was happening, why in the 21st century women were still having to wait for so many years for conclusive diagnoses, where they were still being told that their pain was all in their heads. What I wanted to do was unravel this issue and get back to the roots and try and figure out historically where it all began.
It certainly feels at the end of the book like the whole strand has been there unraveled on the floor. But the lyrics change, but the song remains the same. Is how it felt to me. And I mean, which historical myths about women's bodies would you say that modern medicine hasn't yet fully shaken off?
I think that the principal myth that modern medicine hasn't shaken off is that the primary condition of existing in a female body is to be a body in pain. That pain is women's lot in life. It's what we are born to experience. It's what our life cycle is marked out for through menstruation, reproduction, menopause, etc. And I really think that there are many myths, I think, from history that we are grappling with and that are real obstacles to our care. But I think this basic idea that's very biblical, we have this story of Eve in the Christian tradition, that Eve messes everything up because she wants to know things. So God curses all women to suffer in reproduction, to experience, sorrow and physical pain. This is such a deeply embedded idea. And because it's cultural, it's not just medical, it's not just a medical notion, it's a deeply cultural idea that women experience pain. That's a natural thing. So I think especially around gynecological conditions, around conditions that affect women specifically related to reproductive biology, this myth that we exist to experience pain, therefore our pain is not immediately a medical issue. It's a condition of our gender. It's not a condition of our needing support from a medical system. And that's one I would say, yeah.
Sorry. I mean, I was just thinking really that in your book as well, you give a real sense of the sort of the cruel affinity of the menstrual cycle and the way that it is used as validation for that. The routineness of pain or perceived pain or imagined worse pain, I think you say that it is, and the idea that it can be cured through reproductive function. And so there's a sort of horrible ironic sort of melding of those myths with biological fact to concretize in the male mind.
Yeah, completely. The justification of these myths throughout history in, as you say, the male mind, because medicine for centuries was dominated by male minds, by male practitioners. It wasn't a practice that women were admitted to for many centuries. So we've inherited thousands of years of male-mindedness around what women's bodies what it's like to live inside a woman's body, and the justification for certain beliefs is drawn from biological theories, which kind of just layers on the cruelty, doesn't it? It's like the cure for pain is more pain. The cure for menstrual pain is to go through the pain of birth, pregnancy. It's like you keep layering on, cementing on those sort of pain, layers of pain causing condition.
Yeah, and so often the pain suffered in the aftermath of difficult or traumatic birth.
Yeah, absolutely. The emotional pain as well as the physical pain.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the book, you show how so for those who haven't yet read the book and are I'm sure teetering on the brink, could you give us a couple of examples of from history of how medicine has interpreted women's symptoms through morality or psychology?
Absolutely. So the book begins at the sort of start of what we might call the Western medical tradition. So the tradition that our mainstream medical practice is embedded in, which I sort of situate in classical Greece with the writings of the legendary physician Hippocrates, or the physicians associated with the legendary Hippocrates, who I'm sure all heard of because his name is given to the principles of ethical medicine, the Hippocratic Oath. So the Hippocratic writers were the first medical writers in our history to really sort of divorce illness from supernatural forces, from religion, from curses, from that kind of thing, and to really think about disease and illness as organic processes in the body. So they wanted to figure out why people get sick, what can be done to help them. So far, so good, right? And they had lots of very ethical ideas about how you treat patients, and that you should, of course, first do no harm. But these physicians are deeply embedded in a social system that's very misogynistic and very deeply patriarchal. And within that system, there are very specific ideas about men's bodies and women's bodies, and what men do in society and what women do. Women are primarily seen as reproductive vessels, reproductive beings whose purpose is to bear and raise the children of men. So the ideas of these physicians, these early physicians, were rooted in this kind of social beliefs, because these physicians were not able to look through a diagnostic imaging technique and see what was actually happening inside the body. The classical physicians didn't perform autopsies either. So what they were doing was looking at the symptoms. So say a woman was experiencing very painful menstruation when she was young. Instead of understanding that something might be going on in her body, they understood that she should be performing her reproductive duty, for example. Similarly, with young women who had symptoms of emotional distress, what we might now identify with a variety of mental health conditions, those kind of symptoms were also linked to the necessity within a woman's body to get working with reproducing, to get pregnant, to have marital sex, to have babies, to give birth to them, to nurse them. These were seen as the health-giving events because it was what a woman's body was seen as being for. So this foundational ideas about women's bodies being primarily reproductive, that reproduction is health-giving, that reproduction gives the female body its equilibrium, were woven into medical thinking as the centuries wore on, even as new knowledge was produced. So the primary idea that women are reproductive really stayed. And I think this has very much shaped how women have been seen within our Western medical tradition. So they've held, so if you think about their illnesses, the unwell women being seen as a woman who is not somehow doing her womanhood properly, right? She's either not yet reproducing, or she's begun menopause and she's not able to do it anymore. There's a sort of unwomanness in an unwell woman. So the idea throughout medicine that we get pregnant and that makes us well really, really sticks. And as we move through the centuries, more ideas are kind of pegged onto this basic principle. So doctors start having a lot to say about it's necessary for women to be domestic or quiet, or to not read novels, or to not ride horses. There are a variety of crackers theories that I talk about in the book. But the principal idea of a well woman is a reproductive, domesticated woman who toes the social line.
And there's a big overlap, isn't there? You point out in the book between the things that women are told not to do and the things that either are fun or make you smarter.
Yeah, basically, yeah. Anything to do with deciding what you want to do with your body and your life. Anything that might, enhance your intellect or give you a sort of broader view of the world. Anything that might take you out of the domestic space or make you yearn for a life beyond marriage and motherhood are very often throughout history pathologized as the cause of diseases and illnesses in women, principally among them hysteria.
And the kind of the philosopher bit in me calls that agency, which is, I know and I was actually, you said that philosophy is part of your background as well, and the parallels with liberalism and the idea of the of the rights of the individual is a very strong one, isn't it? That you have those liberal Enlightenment philosophers centering the individual at the heart of ethics, but that didn't include really women or slaves, because the very notion of the individual was of a wealthy man, and it's very similar with that Hippocratic tradition that you're
so similar. And it's so interesting that you make that point, because I'm really fascinated in the idea of women being exempted from citizenship, or the idea of being a citizen or being a fully sort of realized human, by virtue of these sort of biological traits and this kind of biological essentialism that the male mind has deemed to be the reason why women cannot fully occupy citizenship or cannot occupy it on an equal footing to men. And medicine, doctors had a hugely influential role, I think, in determining what a woman was in terms of her personhood. We don't now imagine that, like the lead psychologist from the Royal Free would sort of write an op-ed in The Guardian about why it's a very bad idea for women to work outside the home. Like, imagine such a thing happening. Well, then you have 19th century medicine, and around when key debates are happening around what the significance of people and their relationship to society really is. Doctors really did have quite an influential role to play in this, because they were speaking from science. So the things they said, they deemed to be irrefutable fact. So I'm thinking, for example, about doctors in the 19th century who had an awful lot to say about menstruation, and they thought that menstruation exempted women from further study, from a university level study, and that by virtue of menstruating, that women didn't have the resources of energy necessary for them to expend on studying. And so they went to great lengths to kind of promote sort of what we would now call an anti-feminist ideology, which was to say, look, we can't be expanding women's rights because it will literally lead to the downfall of society. You let women into colleges and their ovaries will blow up. They don't have enough energy in the system to sustain the mind and to sustain the uterus. So it was often couched in these almost apocalyptic terms that the denial of women's full personhood linked to their susceptibility to frailty, to physical delicacy, and illness, was a reason to exempt them from the world around them.
The for your own good vibes were very
yeah.
strong
Yeah.
throughout the book. I mean,
Yeah.
was there a historical figure or a particular patient story that you couldn't stop thinking about after writing the book?
Yeah, and there are many. I mean, Grace, who I mentioned earlier, was my initial companion
Yeah.
in writing the book. Grace, who died of lupus. I didn't actually tell her story in the book in the end because I don't know whether it felt too personal or whether it just didn't have a place that made sense. But I've talked about her in most interviews I've done for the book, because she was so important to formulating my thinking around the need for this book. And I wanted to honor that. I mean, she was a girl from a working family. She only appears in the historical record because she was unwell and she died, and some doctors wanted to write a case study of her and publish it. And this to me was really important because it made me think, okay, when we're working with the history of real people who might only emerge into the historical record because of their suffering, there are certain decisions, there's certain care, right? You have to do a duty of care towards these subjects and make sure, I think, that their stories are being told in order to hopefully advance some change or to resonate with readers, rather than because they're salacious or they're gratuitous or they're going to have a kind of, shock factor. A lot of the stories I tell in the book do have a degree of shock factor. But those decisions, I think, are really important when the kind of figuring out where you stand ethically, what your care is to your historical subjects is very important to me. There was another woman who was described in a very early 20th century neurological clinic paper from the States. And she was the subject of a lecture given by this neurologist because she had this incredibly kind of storied history of nervous and hysteric illness. And she had been through some truly horrible procedures, some surgical interventions into her anatomy that were completely needless, like to kind of cure her. Nymphomania was one thing that was named to cure her extreme nervousness, her hysteria. And what really struck me about this case study was that this woman was allowed to leave the kind of residential clinic, facility, asylum, as they were called then. And she took on work as a nurse. And then she talked, well, the case study, because she's not voicing this, the case study says that her symptoms, as they were described, vanished.
Mm.
And it really struck me that there was this young woman who was diagnosed with illnesses that don't exist. Hysteria isn't real. Nymphomania, it isn't real. These are terms created by doctors in the past to explain away certain behaviors in women that are not concordant with societal ideals, or certain symptoms in women, illness symptoms that are not immediately explainable. So she wasn't unwell, but what she was trapped within this sort of diagnostic cruelty because she did not conform to the ideal of a domesticated young woman in the late 19th, early 20th century. And once she took on this meaningful work, as it was described in the case notes, that was what she needed. She needed a life outside of what had been prescribed for her. And this story always struck me as a sort of perfect exemplar of medicine's historic failings of women. And that's to conflate the desire for life with illness, dysfunction, ailment.
Yeah.
So she always really stayed with me. And what's so interesting is that her story was not being told by this particular neurologist because he thought it was so great that she was cured. It was told because of all the treatments and all the diagnoses that she'd been through. It was a medical case. So it's like, I have worked with this woman. Look at all these things that she's experienced. Aren't I clever? But in reality, it's a story of what happens when women who simply desired a life of their own were pathologized,
Yeah.
medicalized and pathologized.
Yeah. Yeah. For that very desire to express themselves and be
Yeah.
free. And just thinking about thinking about that experience of women with doctors in particular, the burden of proof often seems to fall on patients, and particularly women with poorly understood illnesses. Has medicine, do you think, always demanded this kind of performance from
Yeah.
women to demonstrate or to prove their sickness?
Yes, I think medicine has absolutely demanded this kind of performance from women, but at the same time, it has punished them for performing their illness. It's required women to exhibit a certain selection of illness behaviors. And when those behaviors are exhibited, then women have been pathologized and punished for them. Hysteria is the prime example of this, because we read in the literature many descriptions of women who were diagnosed with hysteria of some form, being, having disordered speech or episodes of, nervous tremors, for example, or some kind of some very visible, very locatable symptoms that can be seen by the doctor. But yet those symptoms are the exact same symptoms that then have women penalized as being attention seekers, as being not genuinely ill. So it's really, women have often been stuck in this kind of horrible circularity again that we kind of keep coming back to, where medicine is required of them something and then punish them for it.
Yeah. It's almost like what you're describing is almost like a threshold where up to a certain level, women can talk about symptoms and they can be dismissed as nothing.
Yeah.
And then
Yes.
past a certain threshold, those same or an amplification of those symptoms becomes it becomes again the woman's problem, not for speaking up about what is seen as trivial, but for then exemplifying all that's wrong with disordered women's bodies.
Yes,
so there's
absolutely.
a flip over from it's your fault to now it's your fault.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And there's no space
absolutely.
in between where women's experience of being ill can be examined on its own terms.
The legitimacy, women have always had to perform a kind of choreography of legitimacy somehow. And I feel that now. I feel that is something that is still asked of chronically unwell women. So many chronically unwell women that I have either been in contact with since the book's out or that I know personally, we have a kind of understanding of how you navigate that doctor's office or that appointment with your GP or that consultant appointment. We know what is being asked of us in that room. We learn how to access the care we need. We learn what will have us deemed difficult and what will have us deemed, pleasant to deal with. And often this is often this is a kind of form of advocacy or a form of, protection, a way that we learn to navigate these systems that we're in that are often broken, often don't serve us. But it's definitely something I always think about this. So in the 17th century, hysteria was first described. So hysteria has kind of been with us in some form or another since ancient Greece, but hysteria as this kind of nebulous nervous disease that principally affected women was first described in the 17th century. And the person who dedicated the most kind of column inches to this disease was Thomas Sydenham, who was the so-called English Hippocrates. Thomas Sydenham was one of the most important figures in the history of chronic illness, naming illness and describing it. And he talks about hysteria, and he essentially throws every conceivable symptom you can think of into this kind of bandwagon. He's like, okay, this is a hysteric woman. She might come to you with pain, nervousness, insomnia, you name it, it's on his list. One of the symptoms of hysteria that Sydenham names is a woman talking about her own pain. So simply by virtue of talking about pain confessing pain, describing pain. By Sydenham's definition, she could be termed hysteric. So it's written in, this is, I think, what I mean when I say that these issues we're facing today are so ingrained, is that they are knitted into the writings of the so-called kind of fathers of chronic illness understanding.
Yeah, and it's this. I'm sure there's a fallacy term for it, but it's a circuitous logic, isn't it?
Yeah,
Where you say
absolutely is.
if you start with the problem and then bundle the experience of every possible aspect of the experience of being a woman under the diagnosis, then it's self-perpetuating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the striking things in the book, chapter after chapter, many end with a hero, or at least often a very flawed hero of some sort, who makes a change, who makes a difference, who offers the tantalizing prospect that things might get better, that women might be treated better, but especially by the time we get to the modern age. But in what you write about the pill, about ME, autoimmunity, it shows that it's far from the case. What makes some illnesses especially vulnerable to disbelief, do you think?
I think that at least the way that our medical system is set up is that we don't deal well with something that isn't immediately visible or can be encoded with data or can be visualized on a screen or in a scan.
Yeah.
So if the majority of chronic illnesses, especially those that you just named, begin with symptoms like fatigue and pain and maybe feelings of weakness or malaise. These are the symptoms that historically have been dismissed as either conditions of being a woman or of hysteric, it's all in your head symptoms. So pain, fatigue are subjective symptoms. They affect us all so differently. Our experiences of them is ours alone. They're universal experiences, but the way we experience them is our own. We can't measure them. We can't visualize them. What we can do is show how they affect our lives, right? We can prove how they affect our lives, our relationships, our day-to-day experiences, but what is actually happening in the body, that relies on the health professional who's looking after you to believe in what you are saying. And this is the issue when the first port of call for legitimizing, validating a person's pain begins with a subjective description. Women especially are set up to fail or to be disbelieved. There are studies that have been conducted that show that when women express pain, they talk about being in pain, and men do exactly the same thing, that women are seen as being less deserving of pain relief, of analgesics, of opiates, and also it's less necessary for women to be referred for more complex diagnostic testing. This is a bias that is very, very much with us, that has been tested in a kind of outside of medical profession as well, on, so-called lay people. And so this is a bias, again, culturally, that we hold. And it sort of extends outside of medicine. And what we need, the way I feel about it is that the more we understand that speaking up about one's pain for a woman automatically kicks in a bias that her pain is not real. The more we understand the roots of where these myths have come from, the more hopefully we can begin to think about a diagnostic encounter that does not need an immediate, here it is on a scan. This is, doesn't need the objective, where the subjective can be taken as evidence.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's no coincidence to me that the illnesses that affect primarily women, that affect more women than men, are the ones that tend to begin with the symptoms that are easy to dismiss out of hand.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that you highlight in the book is that women suffer more from chronic conditions. That many chronic conditions are multisystemic and diversely symptomatic.
Yes.
Is our medical system just structurally uncomfortable with uncertainty, diversity, complexity?
Yes. We know, I think anyone who has a chronic condition will appreciate how the different disciplines of medicine do not speak to one another. So one of the problems I had when I was pregnant, and I had this complex pregnancy where my son, who when I was pregnant had a very slow heart rate, so I was being cared for by fetal cardiology. So I was tested for these antibodies that may have caused this heart condition. Tick, I have them. But it wasn't the fetal cardiologist's job to then get me a rheumatologist, refer me for care, think about what medication I might need, or talk to me about how what had been discovered would affect my body.
Yeah.
Her concern was making sure that we could take the steps to hopefully right this idiosyncrasy in my unborn son's heart. So I fell between the cracks. And I think this happens to so many. I know this is the experience of so many of us who suffer with chronic conditions, is that a rheumatologist might be appropriate for some of what we're going through. But we need, and we also might be seeing, a gastroenterologist, we might be seeing a surgical specialist, but often these disciplines do not speak to each other. We should have, in my opinion, like a multifactorial, multisystemic department in which those of us who have these complex conditions that cut across so many disciplines can go. But we so often have to navigate this system that is very much about classification, about limiting down what is happening in order to treat what is happening. And that's not how chronic illnesses work.
Yeah. And they require holistic understanding and engagement. But
Yeah.
what you're talking about is the very dissection of the body while it's alive, where it's carved up between the specialisms.
Yes.
One is looking at your heart, one's looking at your womb. And, and they're not in conversation, and you become the vessel.
Yeah, you do. You do. You
and
become kind of parceled out, like passed out across. And often, I'm sure, again, anyone who is living with chronic illness knows the frustration of having like being recalled for multiple tests across your different various doctors you see. Like I have eye tests for one department, I have others because the medication I take can affect my retina. So, and then the work and the labor that we go through to kind of deal with all of that is also debilitating in and of itself, just navigating the everyday kind of labor of having a complex condition.
And
because the system is not set up to support us. So we have to kind of patch it together ourselves.
And become your own researchers and doctors, and that cause trouble in its own right. But yes, absolutely. I mean, what is it about medical education, do you think, that leads to so many women being dismissed because of anxiety or other psychosocial explanations?
I remember doing a talk just when the book came out online for an American kind of cardiovascular teaching facility within a major hospital. And there was their sort of head registrar was an older man doctor who, before we went online for the discussion, told me that in the 70s, when he was doing his training, that he was told that certain symptoms, she's hysterical. She just is. So it was absolutely written into medical education. And so these symptoms included like a feeling of that something's in your throat, which is called like globus hystericus, I think, this kind of feeling of like a blockage in your throat. There were other symptoms as well, like various kind of pain. Again, come back to our two favorites, our two bedfellows, pain and fatigue.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's relatively recent, right? That doctors are being actively told to dismiss out of hand women with certain symptoms, like she's just making a fuss. I do think in the conversations I've had with much younger doctors, I feel like gender equality, diagnostic equality is so much more part of the kind of conscious understanding of what it means to be a health professional now. But I do think that there is just not enough. I mean, for starters, wouldn't it be great if we could have like a bit of teaching about what medical misogyny actually is? You know, it's not just a buzzword. I'm sure everyone has been frustrated by hearing our former health secretary, Wes Streeting, using medical misogyny to kind of get on the side of us when he was proposing this revised women's health strategy that's now vanished into thin air. But the idea that these terms are just sort of buzzy, they're not. They're meaningful, and they signify failure in care that has not been properly addressed, I think, by medical education.
It's not so much of a male profession anymore.
Yeah.
Are women doctors better?
I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, I do read this often. You know, more women are entering medicine than ever before. I think they're now, or at least they were maybe last year, outnumbering men entering the profession. And that's brilliant. You know, what we need is more gender equity across the medical profession. Of course we do. I don't think that being a woman necessarily means that you will treat every woman really well or treat all patients really well. I think what is really important is education for all healthcare professionals on the consequences of the medical dismissal of women and people of minoritized genders, gender expansive people. Education on what are the actual consequences of that. Because if we're going to look at it as a purely economic issue, just take our kind of emotions out of this, you know, the cost to the UK economy of not just like loss of labour, loss of workforce, but also of NHS spending, right? You've got a woman who presents with the early symptoms of what turns out to be endometriosis. Current diagnostic time is 9 years and 4 months average.
Yeah.
If we look at it in purely economic terms, that's an absolute, like a squanderance of resources.
Yes.
So when you cut the cake like that, the only answer is this system has a problem with women. Because it doesn't make sense otherwise. The consequences are so clear. You know, we can becoming more and more conscious every day of the burden to people's everyday lives of being unwell and not having clear answers and not having reliable support. Those, you know, it's not an unknown. It's not a shadowy and unknown thing. This is well documented. We've got figures, we've got costs. So when it all kind of shakes down, we think, okay, this system really does have a gender inequity problem. It's root, and I don't believe for a second. I think that you know, like most of us who live in this country, the concept of the NHS is a wonderful, truly wonderful thing. Socialized medicine is exceptionally important. I don't believe that the majority of people that work within the service are at all consciously trying to hurt or harm anyone. I really don't. But they are also working within a broken system, just like the patients are. They are not given the resources that they need to care for their patients properly. They're not given the education they need to care for their patients properly as the burden of chronic disease changes. As more people are living longer, people are becoming more unwell with more complex conditions. We understand more about complex chronic conditions and how many of them overlap. You know, we are not, the system is not working for us, but it's also not working for the people who work in it, is how I feel.
Yeah. And I think like resource constraint breeds simplicity or simplisticness of thinking.
Yeah.
Doesn't it? So if you don't have much time, if you don't have access to many options, then you're given a short amount of time to make a decision between 2 or 3 things. And ultimately under those conditions, it's easier for a doctor to think, well, you know, here's your card.
Yeah.
here's your diagnosis.
Yeah.
You know, there you go. Be grateful, because
Yes. Yeah.
to deal with complexity means dwelling in not knowing
It
for a
does.
while,
It really
and
does.
that takes time,
Yeah.
and it takes a certain loss of face and authority,
Mm.
whereby instead of feeling under pressure to give the answer straight away,
Yeah.
you have to, okay, well, I'm not sure. Tell me more.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
then, well, what we'll do is over the next few weeks, we'll explore a few things,
Yes.
and
Yes.
but so there's those resource and structural constraints make
Mhm.
that very way of thinking
Yeah.
less possible.
Yeah.
But
If
it
you've
sounds
got
like when it
8
comes to yeah,
minutes if you've got 8 minutes or something, whatever an average GP appointment is
yeah,
now, that's assuming, you as the patient can get in there, articulate everything clearly. That's not how humans work. It's oftentimes GP doctor's appointments are traumatic. Oftentimes talking about how you feel, talking about your pain, talking about your symptoms is not easy for everyone. Not everyone is this perfect dream advocate for their own medical
yeah.
needs. And you have this tiny little bit of time in which you're trying to articulate something that will get the ball rolling. And that's incredibly hard for the people in the room.
I mean, one group of people for whom it's historically been extremely hard is people with ME. I mean,
Yeah.
it's ME Awareness Month at the moment, and you discuss
Mhm.
ME in some detail in Unwell Women. I
Yes.
mean, can you share with the audience some of the key issues that you raised in the book around ME in
Yeah.
particular?
So I talk about the sort of early documentations of what became ME/CFS in the 80s. And there was an outbreak of a, mysterious fatigue and pain causing illness in this village in Lake Tahoe called Incline village. And many people, the majority of them women of a kind of younger middle-aged women, were becoming very unwell with this disease, and they went to doctors, and the majority of them tested positive for Epstein-Barr virus. And so to kind of figure out an explanation for what was going on, this disease was sort of tentatively termed chronic Epstein-Barr symptom, or chronic Epstein-Barr disease, sorry, condition. But because the residents of this particular village were well off, they were, they were white, they were well off, they were of a certain, economic bracket of, I remember reading about one TV interview that talked about this woman who had the illness, but also her fresh, good looks, as if you can, the whole thing of surely you can't look all right and be ill, right?
Sort of heroin
But
chic.
but the press and news agencies, news outlets in the US quickly kind of grabbed onto this as a mass hysterical incident. Like, these are a lot of women who are bored and have too much time on their hands, and they're kind of falling to this mass hysterical episode. Then the following year, what we now know to be an ME/CFS took out half of the girls' basketball team at Incline High School.
Mm.
And then thousands more people across the US were presenting with similar symptoms. But because early on, this disease had been categorized variously as Raggedy Ann syndrome, as the malaise of the 80s, as yuppie flu, which I'm sure many of us have heard that term, it already had this sort of prejudice clinging to it. And then I talk also, so there's the gendered issue as well, that kind of speaks back to the hysterical woman, the mass hysterical incident. But then I talk in the book about a study that was done in the 70s in the UK by psychologists at London Middlesex Hospital. And they decided to look back at cases at the hospital of a condition that at the time was termed benign myalgic encephalomyelitis. So they looked back at all the records that they had of this disease in this particular hospital since about the 1930s. And they noticed, these psychologists, that the majority of the patients who identified as having these symptoms were nurses who'd been working on infectious disease wards, principally treating children with polio. But because it was historical and they couldn't necessarily identify a biological or viral entity, The psychologists conducting this study were like, well, it was clearly a mass hysterical event. And they proposed that it should be named myalgic nervosa, which essentially means emotional pain. It's hysteria by any other name.
Yeah.
And then in the early 90s, I talk about how ME, along with fibromyalgia, was sort of lumped together in this thing called affective spectrum disorder, which was a kind of form of somaticization disorder, as in your emotions are sort of projecting your emotional stress is conjuring symptoms in your body.
Yeah.
So when you have a disease that's sort of burdened by that amount of skepticism and sort of, you know, an awful kind of reputation invented by the media, it's incredibly difficult to kind of have that disease taken seriously and shared of it. So it was really important to me, as with other diseases that I talk about in the book, to just show what people who go through and live with ME are up against. This is the foundation of knowledge.
Yeah.
Is about skepticism, it's about dismissal, it's about, you know, women who have too much time to think about what's going on in their bodies.
Yeah. And do you see some parallels between the treatment of women with ME and other chronic illnesses with the more recent response to long COVID?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think is recent studies, sorry, I'm just looking down at my notes again, but I think the most recent figures suggest that women are about 3 times more likely to have long COVID. So, and we know, I think also that women over the age of 55 are more likely to have it too. Am I right there? It's like in terms of most recent research, yeah. And I think that similarly, the inheritance of the reputation of something like ME that was created by, you know, the long COVID is also a disease that has kind of grown up in the media spotlight, you know, something that has been shrouded and clouded from the beginnings of its documentation with certain assumptions that are already in play about fatigue and pain causing conditions without an immediately identifiable set of biological markers.
Yeah.
Because it isn't enough, again, I think as I was saying earlier, why can it not be enough to demonstrate the impact that this disease is having on one's life, on one's body, on one's capacity? I think and I really do think that the history of the documentation of ME, also of fibromyalgia too, the amount of skepticism that fibromyalgia was shrouded in when it was named, when that was given a name, I think absolutely has contributed to what we're seeing now. But I think if anything, if what we're seeing is an increase in chronic conditions without immediately, you know, without something so determining that we can then create a drug for it that works for everyone.
Yes.
The nature of how we are unwell is changing, right?
Yes.
So how we respond to that medically also needs to change.
Yeah. I mean, there's, you know, it seems to me that the system we operate under excels at dealing with traumatic injury
Yes,
and single source pathogens
absolutely.
or
Yeah,
immediate
yeah.
live single source
Hmm.
pathogens, and it deals great
Yeah,
with those emergency
it
conditions
does. It does.
with that are singular or
Hmm.
even if multiple, then they're there visible.
Yeah. Yes.
But
Yeah.
that's not what most people are ill with now.
No, it isn't. It isn't what most people are ill with now. It's not how most people become unwell for the long term either. But it's it is great at that. The system is great at that. But we need to rethink the system because it is failing
Yeah.
so many unwell people.
Yeah. And there's a paradigm shift there, isn't there, towards,
Yeah,
because obviously there must, I mean, for me, it seems the maddening thing is there must be some wider environmental factors at play with
Yes.
respect to
Yeah.
chronic illness, but there
Yes.
seems to be a profound lack of curiosity.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the perfect way to put it. It is a profound lack of curiosity. I think it mirrors the profound lack of curiosity that there's been around really getting to grips with the causes of autoimmunity, for example. I think
Yes.
that there are really strong parallels there too.
Yeah.
You know, we're
Bring that.
told again and again that autoimmunity is a combination of factors. It might be environmental, it might be post-viral, you know, but what the issue with the speculation and the lack of curiosity, and something that I feel really strongly about, is it opens the floodgates up to exploitation of that unknowingness, to, you know, the kind of theories, like one of the ones that I take, you know, deep issue with is that autoimmunity is more prevalent in women because women, you know, bear the burden of looking after everyone and they can't say no. This is gabble mate for avoidance of doubt. You know, I take an enormous issue with this kind of language, with this kind of what I see as exploitation of people with poorly understood complex chronic conditions. I feel like it's a deeply problematic and troubling issue
Sort
that
of fairy tale
we have.
diagnosis, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
turning it
because
into a
what it
story about
yeah,
moral characteristics that's then
absolutely.
tragic in its
Yes.
outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find that, you know, everyone who lives with a chronic condition deserves a system that adjusts itself to respect the way that we become ill and are becoming ill, as you say. You know, this shift, this paradigm shift. I remember also doing a similar talk when the book first came out, and there was a brilliant French doctor, and he spent a lot of time looking after different marginalized communities in France. So he did a lot of work with trans people. He did a lot of work with traveling communities, with people who are often very prejudiced against or cannot access medical services. And somebody asked the question, well, what would you do to make the system better? And he said, burn it all down and rebuild it. And rebuild it under the advisory of the people it's failing.
Mm, mm.
So you want to understand how to care for chronically unwell people and I understand this is very utopian to imagine that, you know, okay, we're going to like refigure this system and we're going to do it patient-led. You know, we're going to ask you what you need. Of course, that's something to dream for, right? It's something to dream for.
My area is schools and agency and
Mhm.
young people's agency, and my mind
Yeah.
is whirring with parallels that I'd love to explore. Imagining if we
Mhm.
asked children what their understanding of problems in the world were and try to
Yeah.
reimagine education as starting from there. But
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
there's a profound parallel there that we
Yeah.
perhaps
No, I agree.
some other day. But you've given
Mhm.
us, you've given us loads of detail, and yet only really skimmed the surface of what's in your fantastic book. And I would urge others to go and explore further. But I would just like before we wrap up to ask you about the next one. And so can you tell us a little bit about reclaiming the radical history of mothering,
Yes.
and maybe just segue us from
Yeah.
that one fascination to the next.
Course. So my new book that came out in March is called A Woman's Work, Reclaiming the Radical History of Mothering. And it follows a similar timeline as Unwell Women. So it begins in the ancient world, actually begins a bit earlier, 9th century BCE, and continues more or less to the present. And it's a book that is really about how we can think about mothering as a radical practice and how women throughout history and mothers throughout history have operated under a male-dominated system, which has defined what mothering and childbearing is, and how women have mothered in relation to that idea. So you've got the patriarchal institution of motherhood, and then I explore how mothers have resisted that, embraced it, challenged it, tried to overthrow it. But I also look at how mothering has been this really crucial force for social and political change throughout history, that mothers are not just these kind of silent denizens of the domestic sphere, that they've actually been instrumental to some of our most important historical moments. So abolition of slavery, the beginning of women's rights, civil rights movement, feminism. So yeah, it's a political, social, cultural history of motherhood. And the reason that I chose motherhood next comes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of our discussion, which is that in Unwell Women, women's reproductive facility was so often touted as the reason why they could not be part of the world, why women were vulnerable, why they were ill, why they were defective, right? All came down to their sort of maternal and reproductive status.
Mm-hmm.
And the book Unwell Women isn't about mothering. Of course, it takes in pregnancy, gynecological health, reproductive health, but so I always was very curious to kind of pull out that history as well and unravel the roots of certain kind of contemporary beliefs about mothering and motherhood, many of which are kind of resurging with a vengeance now in right-wing politics. So
I was going to ask you about trad wife culture and
yes,
the rise of all of those things.
Yeah, it's been really it's really interesting. One of the things that I unpack the roots of in the new book is this thing called pronatalism, which is where the dominant culture shifts towards encouraging, coercing, forcing even people to adopt certain very gender-defined roles. And when that comes to women, it's that your principal duty to yourself and to the state is to bear children and do what you were made to do. Yeah. And I think we're seeing a real resurgence of this in US politics, particularly, but also, I mean, echoes of it in the statements of various reform politicians too, who are very actively platforming anti-women's rights, anti-abortion care sentiment, anti-contraception sentiment. You know, very much the US does a thing, the UK right wing says, hold my beer. So I think in terms of what we're seeing now, the right absolutely believes that revoking women's rights, rolling back women's rights, reducing women's rights to decide what to do with their bodies and their lives is the route to increasing populations in the future. It isn't, spoiler alert. But for people who are very obsessed with a kind of false past or false narratives around the past, that women are better off in the home, you know, the kind of ideas of a false past, the false nostalgia that fuels things like the trad wife phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so yeah, it's a bit of a
smaller world can be so pretty.
Yes.
But I mean, there's so much that's fascinating in what you say with the political connection there. I mean, the link that is rarely and so rarely well made around, you know, fears about lowering birth rates and about immigration and people refusing to make the link between the two, and then also, but then what you get ultimately is a choice, don't you? If you have low birth rates, you have a choice. You either try to create a world in which adults and potential parents, mostly women but men too, feel that they can have more children. Because most, when interviewed at around 40, 45, say that they would have liked to have had more children.
Yes.
But they don't feel secure enough or capable enough or optimistic enough to bring as many as they would wish into the world. And that's why we need more immigration. But so you have a choice between how do we create the conditions where people feel free and happy to fulfill their wish to bring more children in the world, or how do we force the women to have them?
Exactly. And it's far easier to revoke women's rights and to put women in a situation where really the only thing they have available to them for securing their own stability and safety is marriage and family making. It's far easier to do that than it is to actually transform social conditions so that what you have is a kind of mother-child centered, family-centered society. You know, the kind of right-wing actors who are behind all this pronatalist stuff at the moment understand very well that bringing in the so-called liberal measures that we see in certain countries in Europe, for example, universally free childcare, really generous parental leave packages, much more pay equality, does not lead to increased birth rate.
Yeah.
Why? Because in an equal society, people have choice. They generally have more education. But the more research that's being done at the moment, trying to identify, like, what is the issue? Why are people having fewer babies? And I read a thing the other day that's like, it's a mystery. Yes, on the one hand, the structure, the systems and structures are completely unstable if they exist at all. But there are also huge nuance here, right? You cannot, the decision whether or not to have children is always going to be a combination of factors. And what you rarely read about, I think, is this kind of existential fear that people have now about whether this world is one that they want to bring children into. And, to bring it back to our conversation, which is about the kind of medical system and illness, when we have a country in which we have this, maternity services recruitment crisis, in which people who have trained and worked incredibly hard to bring new life into the world, to look after the bodies that do that, are not being given the resources and the funding they need to do that job properly. If the basic services that mean it's safe to have a baby are precarious, and this is, I don't have any answers to how we sustain the future. I really, really don't. I'm not a demographic scientist. I'm not a data scientist. But I agree with you. Create the societal conditions in which if people want to make families, they feel that that's something that they can do safely, with support, and in whatever family configuration makes sense to them. A lot of the problem, I think, is the overwhelming emphasis we have in our society on the heterosexual nuclear family unit. I often read this thing, and I'm sure you have too, that, women would love to have children, but they can't find the partner. I don't know about this, but I do think that the emphasis on the nuclear family being the convention, the right way to bring up children, that you'd think we'd evolve beyond, but I really don't think we have. How about we make it possible for friends to raise and have children together, for different kind of parenting communities? I mean, again, I'm being very utopian. Why can't we just have this? Come on.
But I think what's at the heart of what you're saying is just like, it comes back to what we're saying about chronic illness as well. It's really complex, it's multifaceted, and there's no easier. So start listening. Start listening to people.
Absolutely.
And
Listen to the people who are experiencing this. I'm fed up, and I'm sure so many of us are, with reading the research, the reports, be it about chronic illness experience or be it about the so-called fertility crisis, that are not engaging with the people who actually understand this, who are making these decisions, who are living lives through the prism of these experiences. I want to give us the qualitative research, right? Give us the large scale, multinational qual research. Quantitative research is great, but want to hear.
It tells you something's wrong, but it doesn't tell you what.
No, exactly. Listen, ask questions and listen, and then begin to think about social structures, about services, about what people need in order to imagine a future for themselves.
And in health as well. So
absolutely.
in well-being, and with well-being probably goes more kids and all of those things. But
exactly. I mean, I think healthcare provision is a huge part of this. It's a huge part of feeling that we can be optimistic about our futures, in family making, as in imagining our lives into the future with chronic illness. We want to imagine a future in which that we are part of, not that we are pushing against, struggling against all the time. And I think these things have very close parallels. And, just listen to the people.
Well, I think that agentic strain clearly goes through both of your books, but there
Yeah.
seems to be I would say there's a kind of shift there from, women as object to increasingly to women as subject, and daring
Yes.
to dream about what
Yeah, I think so.
being a woman in the future,
Yeah, I think
in a preferred future might look like. And
Yeah.
I think that's a nice image to end it on.
You.
So thank you so much for your time and your expertise today. Thanks for giving us an insight into the contents of your book, or both of your books, and for linking it all together for us so beautifully. It's been a pleasure to talk to you tonight.
Oh, thank you so much for your fantastic questions, Rupert, and this was such a joy. So thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Goodbye.
Bye.